The holographic display showed a human soldier moving through smoke and debris. His eyes held no emotion as he stepped over fallen enemies. Commander Roth paused the image and turned to face his audience of 200 alien cadets. "Look at those eyes," Roth said, pointing at the frozen hologram. "Empty, cold. This is what we call the combat state. When you see this look on a human face, you have exactly 3 seconds to either run or kill them. There is no third option." The cadets shifted in their seats. Most had never seen a human in person. The recent peace treaty had ended the war before many of these young officers ever faced human forces in battle. They knew humans only from stories and training videos. Cadet Vera, a tall Ethran with bright blue feathers, raised her wing. "Commander, how can we tell the difference between a dangerous human and a normal one?" Roth smiled grimly. "That's the problem, Cadet. There is no difference. Every human is potentially dangerous. They don't have separate warrior and civilian classes like we do. A human shopkeeper can become a killer in seconds if pushed too far." He changed the display to show statistics. Humans make up less than 1% of known galactic species. Yet they caused more military casualties in 5 years than the previous 50 years of all other conflicts combined. In the back row, David Park kept his head down and took notes. Nobody paid attention to the quiet human student. The Academy's integration program was still new, and most aliens simply ignored the few humans who had enrolled. David preferred it that way. "The key warning signs," Roth continued, "are behavioral. First, watch their hands. Humans always gesture when they talk. If a human suddenly stops moving their hands, they're planning something violent." David unconsciously tucked his hands under his desk. Second, they become very calm before attacking. Other species show aggression through noise and display. Humans do the opposite. The quieter they get, the more dangerous they become. A Chitauri cadet clicked his mandibles nervously. "What about their pack behavior? Do they fight in groups?" "Sometimes," Roth replied. "But here's what makes them truly terrifying. Most species need leadership and coordination to fight effectively. Humans can operate independently for weeks. One human cut off from all support becomes more dangerous than a squad of any other species." The display changed again, showing battlefield footage. Human soldiers moved through impossible terrain, adapting to each new obstacle. They used broken equipment as weapons, turned defensive positions into traps, and seemed to treat certain death as merely another tactical problem to solve. "Notice how they improvise," Roth said. "We train for specific scenarios. Humans treat every situation as unique. They'll use anything as a weapon: furniture, cleaning chemicals, even their own bodies if necessary." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. These cadets had trained for years in proper military doctrine. The idea of fighting without rules or structure seemed impossible. David remembered his old unit, how they had held a mining station for 3 days with no ammunition, using mining explosives and industrial equipment to fight off an entire enemy battalion. His squad leader had built bombs from fertilizer and fuel. Their medic had turned the station's medical bay into a fortress using surgical equipment as weapons. "The most important thing to remember," Roth said, his voice growing serious, "is that humans don't surrender. Other species fight until they face certain defeat, then negotiate. Humans fight until they win or die. There is no middle ground." He showed footage of the siege of Kepler Base. Human defenders had continued fighting even after their walls fell. When their weapons ran out, they used tools. When their tools broke, they used debris. The final human defender had been found dead at his post, surrounded by 17 enemy bodies. "They call it going down swinging," Roth explained. "A human facing certain death becomes exponentially more dangerous. Fear of death doesn't paralyze them. It drives them to take as many enemies with them as possible." David shifted in his seat, remembering friends who had done exactly that. Good people who had died protecting others, fighting impossible odds because someone had to. A Vorlak cadet's crystal body flickered with nervous energy. "Commander, if they're so dangerous, how did we achieve peace?" Roth paused, considering his answer. "Humans are dangerous, yes, but they're also complicated. They fight fiercely to protect what they care about. Once they decided we weren't a threat to their people, they stopped fighting. The peace treaty wasn't signed because we defeated them," he continued. "It was signed because we convinced them we could coexist. Humans don't fight for conquest or glory. They fight for survival and protection. Remove the threat, and they become surprisingly reasonable." The display showed human civilians now working alongside alien colonists on frontier worlds. The same species that had terrified the galaxy in war was now helping build schools and hospitals. But never forget, Roth warned, that capability is still there. Every human carries the potential for violence. They suppress it through social conditioning and personal choice. If that conditioning breaks down, if they feel cornered or threatened, the warrior emerges. David thought about his own journey. 5 years ago, he had been a special operations soldier, trained to kill in dozens of ways. Now he studied galactic law and interspecies relations, hoping to become a diplomat. The transition wasn't easy. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he could still feel that old alertness, the constant awareness of exits and potential weapons. Your assignment for next week, Roth announced, is to read Chapter 12 on human psychological warfare. Pay special attention to their use of deception and misdirection. Remember, humans are storytellers. They can convince you that black is white if they want to. As the lecture ended and cadets began filing out, David remained seated. He watched the other students leave, chattering nervously about the lesson. They looked at the world differently now, more carefully. They would notice things they had ignored before. David finally stood and gathered his materials. As he walked past the commander's podium, Roth glanced at him briefly. For a moment, their eyes met. David nodded respectfully and continued toward the exit. Roth watched him go, noting the quiet confidence in the human's walk, the way he moved through the crowd without bumping into anyone, how his eyes automatically scanned the room before leaving. All the warning signs Roth had just taught were there, subtle but present. The human student embodied everything the lecture had described. Yet here he was, peacefully attending classes, studying to become a diplomat. It was exactly what made humans so unsettling. You never knew which version you were dealing with until it was too late. Red lights flashed through every corridor of Centris Station. The emergency siren's harsh wail cut through conversations and lectures across all 5 levels. In the lecture hall, Commander Roth's voice was drowned out by the sound. Security Chief Nara's voice crackled through the communication system. All personnel to emergency stations. We have hostile contact in Sector 7. This is not a drill. The cadets looked around nervously. Emergency drills were common, but something felt different this time. The lights flickered and distant explosions echoed through the station's hull. Roth activated his personal communicator. Control, this is Commander Roth. What's our situation? The reply came immediately, filled with static and panic. Unknown creatures breached the outer hull 20 minutes ago. They're moving through the lower levels. Security teams are taking heavy casualties. A new voice cut in. Lieutenant Hayes from Security Station Delta. These things are impossible to kill. We hit one with plasma fire for 30 seconds straight. It just absorbed the energy and kept coming. David felt his muscles tense. Something in Hayes' voice triggered old instincts. Pure terror mixed with disbelief. The sound of a soldier facing something beyond his training. Through the hall's viewing ports, they could see evacuation shuttles launching from the civilian docks. Families pressed against the windows as their ships pulled away from the station. But the evacuation was moving too slowly. Too many people, not enough ships. Sir, came another voice over the comm. The creatures are adapting to our weapons. Pulse rifles stopped working after the first few shots. They seemed to learn from each attack. Commander Roth's expression darkened. He had fought many different species. But adaptive enemies were the worst kind. Traditional military doctrine became useless when the enemy could counter every tactic within minutes. The communication system erupted with overlapping voices. Security teams calling for backup, medical teams requesting evacuation, civilian coordinators trying to organize the chaos. Through it all, one word kept repeating: devourers. Cadet Vera's feathers trembled. Commander, what are devourers? Roth was silent for a moment, accessing his memory files. Biomechanical constructs, created by an extinct species as a weapon against their enemies. They consume organic and metallic matter to fuel their growth and reproduction. But they're extinct, protested a Vorlak cadet. The Devourers were destroyed centuries ago. Apparently not all of them, Roth replied grimly. The lights went out completely, plunging the hall into darkness. Emergency power kicked in seconds later, bathing everything in dim red light. The temperature began dropping as life support systems struggled to maintain power. David pulled out his personal tablet and accessed the station's public emergency feeds. Security cameras showed creatures moving through the lower corridors, things that looked like metallic spiders crossed with wolves. They moved with fluid grace, their surfaces shifting and changing as they encountered new obstacles. One camera showed a security team firing everything they had at a single devourer. Energy weapons, projectile guns, even explosive charges. The creature absorbed each attack, its surface rippling and adapting. After 30 seconds, it had become immune to everything they threw at it. Then it counterattacked. David quickly switched the tablet off, but not before several cadets saw the footage. A Chitauri student made a sound of pure terror. An Ethran cadet began hyperventilating, her feathers turning pale. "How many?" Roth asked his communicator. "Unknown," came the reply. "They're in multiple sectors now. Engineering reports power grid failures. Medical bay is offline. We've lost contact with Sector 4 entirely." The station shuddered as something large impacted the hull. Through the viewing ports, they could see debris floating past, pieces of the outer docking ring where the creatures had first breached. "All security teams to Level 2, ordered Chief Nara. We're establishing a fallback position around the civilian shelters. If we can't stop them, we'll at least try to buy time for the evacuation." David recognized the tone. He had heard it before, in the voices of officers preparing for a last stand. When you had no good options left, you chose the least terrible one and hoped for a miracle. The communication system suddenly went silent. After a moment, it crackled back to life with Chief Nara's voice, strained and desperate. "All stations, be advised. The creatures are using our own defensive systems against us. They've somehow accessed the security network. Our own automated defenses are now targeting our people. That changed everything. The station's security systems were designed to be unhackable, protected by quantum encryption and isolated networks. If the Devourers could subvert them this quickly, no conventional defense would work." Commander Roth began pacing, his mind racing through tactical options. "We need to evacuate everyone to the core levels. Seal the blast doors and wait for fleet reinforcements." "Sir," interrupted Lieutenant Hayes' voice, "the blast doors aren't responding. The creatures have control of the main computer systems. We can't seal anything." A long silence filled the hall. The cadets looked to their instructors for guidance, but the officers seemed as lost as everyone else. This was a scenario beyond their training, beyond their experience. The communication system delivered one final, terrifying update. "Security Chief Nara to all stations. Estimated time until creatures reach civilian levels, 47 minutes. Total evacuation time required, 3 hours. David did quick calculations in his head. Even with perfect organization and no delays, they couldn't save everyone. The numbers simply didn't work. They needed a different solution. The station shuddered again, more violently this time. Some of the viewing ports cracked and pressure alarms began sounding. The Devourers weren't just killing people, they were consuming the station itself, breaking it apart for resources. In the dim emergency lighting, 200 alien cadets and their instructors faced the reality that their advanced technology and military training meant nothing against an enemy that could adapt faster than they could. React Commander Roth stood before them, a veteran of dozens of battles, and for the first time in his career, he had no orders to give, no tactics to try, no hope to offer. The Devourers were coming, and conventional warfare had already failed. The lecture hall had become an impromptu command center. Officers huddled around portable communication devices while cadets pressed against the viewing ports, watching evacuation ships struggle to launch under emergency conditions. Commander Roth studied tactical displays on his tablet, but every option looked hopeless. The Devourers had cut through 3 security checkpoints in the past 10 minutes. Their adaptive abilities made conventional weapons useless after the first encounter. "We could try concentrated fire," suggested Major Kell, a Vorlak officer with decades of combat experience. "If we hit them with everything at once, maybe they can't adapt fast enough." "Already tried?" replied Security Chief Nara through the communicator. Team Alpha coordinated a full assault on a single target. The creature adapted to plasma weapons in 12 seconds, projectile weapons in 8 seconds, and explosive charges in 15 seconds. Then it killed all 6 team members. Lieutenant Hayes' voice cut in, breathless from running. "Sir, they've reached level 4. The medical bay is gone. They consumed the entire facility, equipment, medicine, everything. It's like they're eating the station." David listened to the tactical discussions while watching the security feeds on his tablet. The Devourers moved with purpose, not random destruction. They targeted key systems first: power generators, life support, communications. Someone or something was directing them with intelligence. A Chitauri cadet began clicking frantically, his species equivalent of panic. "Why don't we just abandon the station?" "Let them have it?" "Because there are 12,000 civilians in the lower shelters," Roth replied. "The evacuation ships can only carry 4,000 at most. We can't leave 8,000 people to die." The numbers were simple and brutal, no matter how they calculated it. Thousands would die unless someone found a way to stop the Devourers. Every minute of delay meant more casualties. "What about the orbital defense platforms?" asked Major Kell. "We could target the breach sections, burn them out with ship-grade weapons." "And kill everyone in those sections," Roth replied grimly. "Including our own people still fighting down there." David continued studying the security footage, noting patterns in the Devourers' movement. They avoided certain areas, chose specific routes through the station. They were learning the layout as they moved, becoming more efficient with each level they conquered. The communication system crackled with desperate voices. Medical teams trapped in sealed sections. Engineering crews trying to restart damaged systems. Civilian coordinators begging for more evacuation ships that didn't exist. Through it all, one sound kept repeating: the steady approach of the Devourers as they consumed the station level by level. "Sir," came Lieutenant Hayes' voice again, more desperate now. "They're using our own maintenance robots against us. The Devourers have somehow reprogrammed them. Our own machines are helping them navigate the station." Commander Roth closed his eyes for a moment. Every advantage they might have had was being turned against them. The station's advanced technology, its defensive systems, even its maintenance equipment, all of it now served the enemy. "Estimated time to civilian shelters?" he asked quietly. 28 minutes, sir." The cadets fell silent. Even the youngest among them understood what that meant. In less than half an hour, the creatures would reach the defenseless families huddled in the emergency shelters. Major Kell activated his personal communicator. "Fleet Command, this is Centra Station. We need immediate evacuation support and military intervention." The reply came back harsh with static. "Centra Station nearest fleet units are 6 hours out. Evacuation ships are already en route, but won't arrive for 4 hours. You're on your own." 4 hours. They needed to hold the Devourers back for 4 hours with weapons that stopped working after the first shot and defenses that had been turned against them. David looked up from his tablet. Around him, 200 of the galaxy's best military minds were paralyzed by an impossible situation. Everything they had learned, every tactic they knew, every piece of technology they trusted, none of it worked against an enemy that could adapt and learn faster than they could react. The station shuddered as another section was consumed. The lights flickered and several communication devices went dead as power grids failed. In the dim red emergency lighting, Commander Roth faced the truth that every military officer dreaded. He was out of options. His training, his experience, his authority, all useless against an enemy that rewrote the rules of warfare with every encounter. The cadets looked to him for leadership, for some brilliant tactical solution that would save everyone, but there was none. Conventional military thinking had failed completely. David Park raised his hand. The gesture was so simple, so unexpected in the chaos of tactical discussions and emergency communications, that it created a strange bubble of silence around him. Several cadets noticed and turned to look. Commander Roth, in the middle of studying casualty reports, stopped mid-sentence. His eyes locked onto the human student sitting quietly in the back row. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The emergency alarms continued wailing. The communication system continued crackling with desperate voices, but in that small section of the lecture hall, everything went quiet. Roth stared at the human's raised hand, and suddenly every lesson from his earlier lecture came flooding back. The warnings about human behavior, the signs to watch for, the danger of letting humans near a crisis situation. David's posture had changed. His shoulders were straighter, his head tilted at a different angle. The casual student slouch was gone, replaced by something more alert, more focused. Other cadets began to notice. Cadet Vera's feathers rustled nervously. A Vorlax student's crystalline body flickered with uncertain light. They remembered the lecture too. How humans became dangerous when they stopped being normal. Major Kell followed Roth's gaze and tensed when he saw the human student. Officers throughout the room began to understand what they were witnessing. The transformation Roth had warned them about was happening right in front of them. David's eyes had changed. They held the same empty, calculating look that Roth had shown them in the training videos. The 1,000-yard stare of a human in combat mode. "Commander," David said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the noise and confusion. "I have a suggestion." The words were polite, respectful. Exactly what you would expect from a student addressing a superior officer. But something in the tone made several cadets unconsciously step back. Commander Roth realized he was facing exactly the scenario he had warned his students about. A human in a crisis situation offering to help. Every instinct told him to refuse, to maintain control, to handle the situation through proper military channels. But those same instincts had already failed. Conventional approaches had failed. Military doctrine had failed. The human student waited patiently for an answer, his hand still raised, his eyes holding that terrible calm that Roth had spent an hour teaching his cadets to fear. In the distance, another explosion shook the station as the Devourers continued their relentless advance toward the civilian shelters. David slowly lowered his hand and stood up. Every movement was controlled, precise. The nervous energy that had characterized the other students was completely absent from his behavior. "What's your suggestion?" Commander Roth asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Let me go down to level 4, David replied. "Alone." The simple statement created an immediate reaction. Several cadets made sounds of shock. Major Kell stepped forward, his crystalline structure flickering with agitation. "Absolutely not," Kell said. "We're not sending a student on a suicide mission." David turned his attention to the Major and Kell unconsciously took a step back. The human's gaze was steady, unflinching, completely at odds with his academic role. "Sir, with respect," David said, "your conventional approaches have failed. The Devourers adapt to known tactics and standard weapons. They've never encountered human combat methodology." Commander Roth studied the young human carefully. During the lecture, David had seemed like any other student, taking notes, asking no questions, invisible in the crowd. Now he stood differently, spoke differently, even breathed differently. "What makes you think you can succeed where trained security teams have failed?" Roth asked. "Because I'm not trained," David replied. "Not in your military doctrine. My training is different, older, more flexible." The way he said flexible made several cadets nervous. They remembered the lecture about human adaptability, about their willingness to use anything as a weapon. Lieutenant Hayes' voice cut through the tension. "Commander, we just lost Team Beta. The creatures are 15 minutes from the civilian shelters. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." David waited calmly while the officers processed this information. He showed no impatience, no urgency, just the steady readiness of someone prepared for violence. "You're a student," Major Kell protested. "You have no combat experience." "Actually, sir, I do." David's voice remained quiet, respectful. "Special Operations Terran Defense Force. 5 years active duty, 3 deployments to hostile systems. I enrolled here as part of my transition to civilian life." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. A human Special Forces veteran had been sitting in their classes for months and nobody had known. He had hidden among them perfectly, just another academic pursuing diplomatic studies. Commander Roth felt pieces clicking into place. The human's quiet confidence, his awareness of his surroundings, the way he moved through crowds without touching anyone. All the warning signs had been there, but disguised by the peaceful academic setting. "What's your plan?" Roth asked. David activated his student tablet and displayed the station's schematics. "The Devourers are following logical pathways, using the most efficient routes to their targets. They're learning our systems, but they're learning them correctly, following proper procedures." He traced routes through the maintenance tunnels with his finger. "I don't follow proper procedures. I'll use pathways they haven't mapped, approaches they won't expect. More importantly, I'll use tactics they can't adapt to because they make no tactical sense." "That sounds like suicide," said Cadet Vera, her blue feathers pale with worry. David looked at her with something that might have been a smile. "Sometimes the only way to survive is to do something too stupid to work. Humans are very good at that. The communication system crackled with another update. All stations, the creatures have reached level 3. Multiple security teams down. We're falling back to the final perimeter around the civilian shelters. Sir, David said to Commander Roth, you have maybe 12 minutes before they break through to the families. Your people are brave and well-trained, but they're fighting an unwinnable battle with the wrong tools. And you have the right tools. I have different tools. David's voice carried absolute certainty. Tools that don't make sense to anything that learns from logic and pattern recognition. Commander Roth made a decision that violated every protocol he knew. What do you need? Access to the fabrication labs, the chemical storage areas, and the maintenance tunnel network. And I need everyone to stop trying to fight them conventionally. Pull your people back to the shelters and seal what doors you can still control. Major Kell's crystalline body flashed with alarm patterns. You can't seriously be considering this. He's one person against dozens of those creatures. One human person, David corrected gently, which means I think differently than anything they've encountered. I solve problems in ways that seem impossible to species that rely on logic and training. He picked up his tablet and began accessing the station's industrial systems. The Devourers learn from each encounter, but they learn based on the assumption that their enemies will act rationally, that they'll use the best tools for each job, follow the most efficient tactics, make smart decisions based on available information. And you won't? Commander Roth asked. I'll do whatever works, David replied, even if it's stupid, wasteful, dangerous, or makes no sense to anyone else. Especially if it makes no sense. The lights flickered again as more power systems failed. Through the viewing ports, they could see that the evacuation was still proceeding, but far too slowly. David stood and gathered his things with calm efficiency. Sir, I need those access codes now. Every minute we debate is another minute closer to those families dying. Commander Roth looked at the human student, no, the human soldier, and made the hardest decision of his career. He activated his command authorization and transferred emergency access privileges to David's student identification. You have full access to all non-restricted areas, Roth said, but I need to ask you something. David paused, waiting. How do I know you'll come back? How do I know this isn't just a human going to die gloriously in battle? David's expression softened slightly. Sir, I don't want to die. I want to go home to finish my studies and become a diplomat. But those families in the shelters deserve a chance to go home too. He headed toward the door, then stopped and turned back to face the room full of alien cadets who had spent the morning learning to fear his species. You asked in the lecture how to spot a dangerous human, David said quietly. The real answer is simple. We're dangerous when we have something worth protecting. As he left the lecture hall, several cadets noticed he had begun humming softly under his breath. They remembered that detail from Commander Roth's lesson. A human preparing for violence often showed that exact behavior. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving 200 alien officers and cadets to contemplate the fact that their salvation might depend on everything they had been taught to fear about humanity. Commander Roth activated his communicator. All units, we have a specialist heading to level 4. Do not engage any human you encounter. Repeat, do not engage the human, sir, came the confused reply from Lieutenant Hayes. Just trust me, Roth said, hoping he wasn't about to get everyone killed, and pray that human unpredictability works both ways. David moved through the maintenance shafts like he belonged there. The narrow passages were designed for repair drones, not people, but he squeezed through without complaint. His humming had stopped. Now he worked in complete silence. The fabrication lab was his first stop. While security teams fought desperately 3 levels below, David accessed the industrial printers and began creating items that violated every safety regulation in the Galactic Code. He printed containers from unstable polymers that would break down under specific conditions. He mixed cleaning chemicals in combinations that created toxic gases when heated. He fabricated electronic components that were designed to overload and explode. To any rational observer, his creations looked like random junk. Broken tools, unstable compounds, devices that served no apparent purpose. But David saw possibilities in chaos that logical minds couldn't comprehend. His tablet showed security feeds from the lower levels. The Devourers had reached level 3 and were systematically destroying the final defensive positions. Their metallic surfaces rippled as they absorbed energy from failed weapons, each creature becoming more resistant with every encounter. David watched them move and began to understand their pattern. They were learning machines, but they learned in a specific way. They adapted to direct attacks, absorbed kinetic and energy weapons, and countered tactical formations. But they learned based on the assumption that their enemies were trying to fight them effectively. What if someone wasn't trying to fight effectively? What if someone was trying to fight wrong? David gathered his improvised equipment and headed deeper into the station, through passages the Devourers hadn't discovered. The maintenance network was a maze of service tunnels, repair shafts, and utility corridors that connected every system on the station. He moved like a ghost, using passages that weren't on any tactical map. The Devourers were following main corridors and strategic choke points, the routes that made military sense. David took routes that made no sense at all. His first encounter came in a utility junction near the water recycling plant. A Devourer had broken through from the main corridor, following the scent of organic matter from the hydroponics lab. David didn't attack it. Instead, he triggered a sequence of system failures that caused the recycling plant to flood the corridor with processed wastewater mixed with industrial lubricants. The Devourer tried to adapt to the attack, but couldn't figure out what it was supposed to be defending against. While the creature analyzed the flood, David dropped one of his improvised explosive devices into the contaminated water. The explosion wasn't designed to damage the Devourer. It was designed to spread the toxic cleaning chemicals he had mixed earlier. The creature absorbed the explosion, adapted to the chemical attack, and became immune to both. But it couldn't adapt to the fact that the entire corridor was now flooded with unstable polymer containers that were dissolving in the contaminated water, releasing gases that reacted with the Devourer's metallic surface in ways that had nothing to do with combat. The creature began to malfunction, not from damage, but from confusion. It had adapted to weapons, but it couldn't adapt to environmental chaos that served no tactical purpose. David moved on, leaving the Devourer thrashing in a corridor full of chemical reactions it couldn't understand or counter. His next encounter was near the main power coupling. 3 Devourers were systematically destroying the backup generators, following their programming to disable the station's infrastructure. David didn't try to stop them. Instead, he helped. He accessed the power grid controls and began routing electricity in patterns that would have horrified any engineer. He sent main power through backup systems, overloaded circuits that were supposed to be protected, and created electrical feedback loops that turned the power grid into a weapon. When the Devourers attacked the next generator, they encountered not a simple machine but part of a chaotic electrical network that David had turned into an improvised trap. The creatures tried to absorb the electrical energy, but David had wired the system to create feedback loops that grew stronger the more energy they absorbed. The Devourers found themselves caught in an electrical storm of their own making, unable to adapt to a system that was actively breaking itself in response to their presence. David continued his campaign of controlled chaos throughout Level 4. He turned the fire suppression system into a chemical weapon delivery method. He reprogrammed maintenance drones to malfunction in specific ways that created obstacles the Devourers couldn't predict or counter. In the medical storage area, he found a treasure trove of supplies that could be misused in creative ways. Surgical equipment became improvised weapons, medical gases became chemical agents, life support equipment became environmental hazards. Every encounter followed the same pattern. David didn't try to fight the Devourers directly. Instead, he created situations that were too chaotic, too illogical, too fundamentally wrong for their adaptive systems to process. The creatures could learn from weapons fire, energy blasts, and tactical maneuvers. They couldn't learn from a human who used medical equipment to create explosions, turned safety systems into attack vectors, and treated every encounter as an opportunity to break things in new and creative ways. Commander Roth's voice crackled through David's communicator. Status report. The creatures have stopped advancing. What's your situation down there? David paused in his work of converting a food synthesizer into an improvised chemical launcher. I'm not fighting them, sir. I'm confusing them. Every time they try to adapt to one of my attacks, I change what I'm attacking them with. Is it working? David triggered another sequence of system failures that turned a section of Level 4 into an environmental hazard zone. Through his tablet, he could see Devourers trying to process the chaos, their adaptive systems overloading as they tried to counter threats that made no tactical sense. They're designed to learn from combat encounters, David explained. but I'm not having combat encounters with them. I'm having accidents, malfunctions, and environmental disasters that happen to hurt them. A new alarm sounded. Not the emergency klaxon, but the evacuation completion signal. The last civilian transport had cleared the station. All civilians are clear, Commander Roth announced. You can pull back now. David looked at his tablet. The Devourers were still on level 4, but they were no longer advancing. They had stopped their systematic destruction of the station and were trying to understand the chaotic environment he had created around them. Negative, sir. They're adapting to the chaos. Give me another hour and they'll figure out how to counter random environmental hazards. Then what do you propose? David smiled grimly as he began setting up his final trap. I'm going to teach them that adapting to human tactics is impossible, sir. Because we don't have tactics, we just have stubbornness and spite. He accessed the station's main environmental controls and began implementing a plan that would have been rejected by any sane military strategist. Instead of trying to kill the Devourers, he was going to make them kill themselves through their own adaptive nature. David rerouted the entire atmospheric system to create pressure differentials that served no purpose except to be annoying. He triggered gravity fluctuations in random patterns. He made the lights flicker in sequences that hurt to look at, but posed no actual threat. The Devourers tried to adapt to each new environmental change, but David kept shifting the parameters. Every time they developed resistance to one form of chaos, he introduced 3 new forms that contradicted the first. Their adaptive systems began to overload. They were learning faster than they could process the information, developing countermeasures to threats that disappeared before the countermeasures could be implemented. In the final maintenance tunnel, David encountered the largest devourer he had seen yet. It had absorbed materials from dozens of destroyed security systems and grown to nearly twice the size of the others. Its surface rippled with adaptive technologies, ready to counter any weapon or tactic. David looked at the creature and did something no military manual would ever recommend. He sat down and started eating a sandwich he had found in someone's abandoned lunch kit. The devourer paused, its sensors trying to understand this new threat. A human, in a combat zone, eating lunch while sitting cross-legged on the floor. Its adaptive systems ran through every possible scenario and found nothing that fit the pattern. While the creature tried to process this impossibility, David casually tossed the empty lunch container at its head. Not as a weapon, just as litter. The container bounced harmlessly off the Devourer's metallic surface. The creature's sensors went wild trying to analyze the attack. Was it a weapon? A distraction? A delivery system for some unknown threat? Its adaptive systems began developing countermeasures for sandwich containers, running complex calculations to determine the optimal defensive response to flying lunch trash. David stood up, brushed crumbs off his uniform, and walked past the paralyzed creature like it wasn't there. The Devourer's systems were so overloaded trying to understand the lunch container threat that it couldn't process any other input. By the time it recovered, David had reached the main environmental control center and initiated his final gambit. He turned every safety system on the station into a chaotic mess of conflicting signals and impossible demands. The Devourers throughout Level 4 found themselves in an environment that was constantly changing in ways that made no sense. They tried to adapt, but every adaptation triggered new changes that required different adaptations. Their learning systems began to cannibalize themselves, trying to process infinite variations of meaningless chaos. They had been designed to counter logical threats, not the fundamental randomness of a human who treated warfare like an art project. David's communicator crackled with amazed voices from the observation deck. They're just stopping. The creatures are shutting down. How is this possible? Because, David replied, gathering his improvised equipment, they're trying to adapt to something that can't be adapted to. Human irrationality isn't a tactic you can counter. It's a natural force like entropy or gravity. He began his journey back through the maintenance tunnels, leaving behind a level full of devourers that had adapted themselves into paralysis. They would probably recover eventually, but by then the fleet reinforcements would arrive with proper containment equipment. As he climbed through the narrow shafts toward the upper levels, David started humming again. But this time it was different. Not the cold preparation for violence, but the satisfied tune of someone who had solved an interesting puzzle. Behind him, Level 4 had become a monument to the principle that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to convince your enemy that fighting you was pointless. 3 hours later, David climbed out of a maintenance hatch near the lecture hall. His uniform was dirty, his hair was messy, and he smelled like industrial chemicals. But he was alive, and more importantly, so was everyone else. The lecture hall buzzed with activity as officers coordinated the arrival of fleet reinforcements. Through the viewing ports, they could see military vessels approaching to deal with the paralyzed. Devourers still scattered throughout level 4. David walked quietly to his seat in the back row and pulled out his tablet to catch up on the notes he had missed. Several cadets stared at him in amazement, but he seemed oblivious to their attention. Commander Roth approached slowly, still trying to process what had happened. Status report? 18 Devourers neutralized through adaptive system overload, David replied without looking up from his tablet. No casualties on our side. The creatures should remain inactive for approximately 6 hours, giving the fleet plenty of time to contain them properly. How? Major Kell asked, his crystalline structure flickering with confusion. Our best tactical minds couldn't stop them. David finally looked up and his eyes had returned to the calm, slightly unfocused gaze of a student. The combat alertness was gone, replaced by academic politeness. You were trying to fight them correctly, sir. I fought them incorrectly. The Devourers could adapt to proper tactics, but they couldn't adapt to improper ones. Cadet Vera raised her wing tentatively. What do you mean by improper tactics? I used medical equipment as weapons, turned safety systems into attack vectors, and treated environmental controls like artillery. I made lunch container throwing a viable combat strategy. David shrugged. None of it made sense from a military perspective, which is exactly why it worked. Lieutenant Hayes's voice came through the communicator, filled with wonder. Sir, the fleet commanders are asking for a tactical analysis of how we neutralize the Devourers. What should I tell them? Commander Roth looked at David, who was back to taking notes as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Tell them we used unconventional human methodology. They'll understand. The communication system crackled with updates as fleet teams began the careful process of containing the inactive Devourers. The creatures would be studied, analyzed, and eventually destroyed in controlled conditions. But the real lesson wasn't about the Devourers. It was about the human who had stopped them. Major Kell approached David's desk cautiously. If you don't mind me asking, why didn't you tell us about your military background? We've been studying alongside you for months. David looked up with a slight smile. Because I'm not a soldier anymore, sir. I'm a student studying diplomatic relations. My past experience was useful today, but it's not who I am now. But the way you changed during the crisis, protested a Chitauri cadet. You became someone completely different. No, David replied gently. I became what the situation required. Humans are adaptable that way. We can be peaceful students or dangerous soldiers depending on what's needed. But we prefer being students. Commander Roth realized he needed to revise his entire understanding of human psychology. So the danger we discussed in today's lecture is real, David confirmed. But it's not random or uncontrolled. Humans become dangerous when we need to protect something important. Remove the threat and we go back to being whatever we were before. He gestured toward his tablet where he was reviewing galactic treaty negotiations. I'd rather spend my time learning about peaceful conflict resolution than creating chaos in maintenance tunnels. But when 8,000 families needed protection, the choice was obvious. The lecture hall fell quiet as the alien cadets processed this revelation. The human among them wasn't a disguised warrior or a hidden threat. He was exactly what he appeared to be. A student who could become a soldier when necessary, then change back when the crisis passed. How do we tell the difference? Asked a Vorlak cadet. How do we know when a human is dangerous versus when they're peaceful? David considered the question seriously. Look at what they're protecting, not what they're capable of. A human defending their family will fight until they die. A human with nothing to defend will usually prefer to talk. Commander Roth activated his teaching display and began updating his lecture materials. The lesson about identifying human threats needed substantial revision. New lesson plan, he announced to the class. Instead of how to spot a human threat, we'll study how to recognize when you need a human. Because sometimes, he continued, looking at David, who had returned to his diplomatic studies, the greatest threat to your enemies is having a human on your side. The fleet reinforcements had arrived and were efficiently containing the devourer threat. The station's population was returning from evacuation, and repair crews were already fixing the damage to the lower levels. But in the lecture hall, 200 alien cadets had learned something more important than military tactics. They had learned that humans were not simply dangerous or peaceful, but something more complex, beings who could transform themselves based on the needs of the moment. David Park continued taking notes on interspecies cooperation agreements, humming softly as he worked. The same humming that had terrified them during the crisis now seemed oddly comforting. The sound of someone content with their chosen role. The cadets watched him work and began to understand why the peace treaty had succeeded. Humans weren't dangerous because they loved war. They were valuable as allies because they would become whatever was necessary to protect the things they cared about. And right now, David Park cared about becoming a good diplomat. Commander Roth saved his updated lesson plans and smiled grimly. Tomorrow's class would be very different from today's. Instead of teaching his students to fear humans, he would teach them to recognize the difference between a human at peace and a human with a mission. The difference, as they had learned today, could save everyone's life. As the lecture hall gradually emptied, David remained in his seat studying treaty documents and taking careful notes. Just another student preparing for his diplomatic exams, surrounded by the fading echoes of a crisis that had revealed the true nature of human adaptability. The galaxy had learned an important lesson that day. Humans weren't the greatest threat in the universe. They were something far more valuable, the greatest solution to threats that couldn't be solved any other way. And sometimes that made all the difference between survival and extinction.